When you think of fathering, one of the major moments in a father's life is when he walks down the aisle with his daughter on his arm and hands her over to another man. A major milestone, a changing of the relationship. It's one of the sweetest memories in any culture, as the wedding day, the ceremonies revolving around it, the pageantry is rich and multi-textured, different in almost every culture, and yet invariably a time of pleasure, a time of joy, a time of excitement, and ultimately a statement of a fathering job well done. Against that backdrop, I have become aware that there's a significant number of young ladies who are not able to be married. I have wondered whether this is an aberration different from other generations, and I simply don't know. I don't have a baseline or any statistical way of measuring this generation versus past generations. I'm also very aware that there are some young ladies that are not seeking marriage, that God did not intend to be married. But having set all of that aside, there is still a very present problem of young women who are godly, who are mature, who are pure, who have a desire to be married, and simply are not able to find a man that even remotely qualifies, much less one that is interested in them. I've been aware of that for some time, but suddenly 2 months ago, God jarred me and said, it's time for you to do something about that. We have in Plumline a number of these young ladies and no pool of young men. And I came in obedience to God and said, okay, it's time for me to do something about it. And by the way, what exactly is it that you want me to do? At that time, I had a blank screen. I knew in theory that a father's job is to prepare his daughter for leading the next generation. In past generations, it was a father's job to actually provide the bridegroom. That has fallen out of favor in our Western cultures. But it is still a father's job to provide spiritually the prayers and even the warfare necessary for his daughter to have a husband. Thus, I began to ponder the whole process, asking God, what do we do? What is my job as a spiritual father in this whole equation? And over the last few weeks, God has given a number of different tools. No one of them is going to touch every life, but it's a process, a new season that He's walking us through. So each month on the cutting edge, there will be another tool, another facet, another way we can pray or way we can do warfare in order to bring about God's desired end, that the man He has designed for each one of these young ladies will be at the right place at the right time and will be fully prepared for the woman that he is to marry. The first issue that I'd like to discuss is that of marks, identifying marks. We see all of Scripture bracketed by two great statements of marks. The first is in Genesis chapter 4 with the story of Cain, where God says, I'm going to put a mark on you as a murderer, as an assassin, and all of society will be able to see it. Now, we don't know whether the mark was on his spirit, soul, or body. The point remains that God is able to label somebody irretrievably, to label them in a way that they cannot remove the label, and to label them in a way that the culture around them can see. You go to the other end of the story, and in the book of Revelation, we see both God and the devil putting marks on their people. Interesting, though, in the first couple of chapters, first 3 chapters of Revelation, we see God speaking about a new name. Both at the church at Pergamum and the church in Philadelphia, God says, I'm going to give you a new name. The fact that God takes the initiative to design the name and to give them a new name, not a second name, not an additional name, but I believe a replacement name, indicates that there is something that can be done to defile our name, to contaminate the name, to hinder the name from being functional. As you look at these two churches, you see three things that are evident. First of all, one of the churches, Pergamum, was in the context of extreme active Satanism. It was in the city where Satan had his seat, his throne, his dominion, his abode. In that church, there was also immorality. And in the church of Philadelphia, there was the issue of false accusation and God's promise of vindication. And against this backdrop, I would suggest to you that our spirits can carry a label that is put on us that does not necessarily represent who we are. In the one case, Pergamum, you're dealing with defilement from the land. Also in Pergamum, you have a second category, which is defilement by personal iniquity. That is the immorality. In the third case, you have defilement by accusation. Even though God vigorously affirmed that the people in the church at Philadelphia were essentially holy and righteous, while he did not agree with the slanderous statements that were made against them, yet God felt the defilement, the toxicity to their name was so great that God had to give them a new name. Now, here's how it played out in real life for one of our young ladies. There were a number of issues that were unresolved in her life, even though she had gone through deliverance in various modes before. So we met with a small deliverance team and began to just seek God broadly, saying, what do you want to show us? Where do you want to take us? He drew some pieces together from past ministry times and added some new pieces, and the bottom line was that one of her forefathers had been involved in treason. We're talking cold, murderous, premeditated, absolutely inexcusable treason for personal advancement. It was a rather horrific picture. We understood that in the traditional fashion, we needed to deal with the sin, rebellion, and iniquity and bring that cleansing forward to this generation. But before we could move in that direction, God began to deal with us about the issue of the label. And when we understood that her family line had been labeled with the word traitor for many generations, all of a sudden, a lot of her life made sense. And she began to explain to us the mysteries of her working career. She is a highly talented young lady. Great skill set, strong character, fully understands the importance of building a platform under her supervisors for them to succeed. She is never in competition with those over her. She is trying to serve them. And yet, in situation after situation, going through a variety of different bosses, the person she would be assigned to would value her work at first. There would be a brief period of teamwork, of compatibility, and then mysteriously the relationship would deteriorate. Mysteriously the trust would go. Mysteriously the boss would begin to develop an adversarial relationship with her, and most overtly begin to make her invisible, criticize her work, steal her ideas, push her down, and then move into extremely predatory actions. Now, she was not trying to steal the limelight. She was not trying to look better at the expense of her bosses, but her bosses perceived her to be in extreme competition. And she never understood it until that deliverance session. There she realized that that label of traitor was on her spirit. And even non-believing bosses working with her in a short period of time would begin to sense with their spirit that she was labeled as a traitor. And even though her actions were impeccable, the message from her spirit would cause them to distrust her immensely and to begin to move proactively to isolate her, control her, subordinate her, crush her before she could walk in treason and crush them. Of course, it was all based on reading the label, not based on the actual nature of the relationship that she had, but it was very effective at destroying her work relationships with most of her bosses. So that day we did warfare. We not only dealt with the sins, the rebellion, the iniquity from the past, but we brought forward the cleansing, the removal of that brand from her spirit. When the ministry session was over, we went home. And that weekend or the next weekend, she went back to a church that she had previously visited. It was a fairly small church, and she went there several times over the course of a few weeks. Never was able to connect with the people. She was obviously known because of the size of the church. Nobody overtly rejected her, but there simply was not connection. She was there. She had been gone for 6 weeks. Nobody from the church contacted her. She really didn't have any membership there. There was no reason for them to contact her in the natural. But when she went back after this ministry time where we removed the label of traitor and asked God to place a new name, a new brand on her spirit, she returned to that church, and it was as though she was one of their best friends. There was an immediate gathering around her, an immediate aligning with her. There was joy that she had returned. There was a connectedness that she had never experienced before, and we can only attribute it to the deliverance work that removed the label from her spirit. It's my opinion that there are a fairly good collection of labels that young ladies can wear, which would cause godly men, righteous men, mature men, men with spiritual discernment to stay clear of them. Clearly, the traitor is one. Another one is the label of an unfaithful, adulterous woman. Another label is Jezebel. Another label is ungodly. Another label is bitter. And what is so maddening about the equation is that the person in this generation does not walk out any of those things. They simply don't. And yet, because of a forefather, because of rank iniquity in the past, that brand can be burned on their spirit, and discerning people react to the message of the Spirit, not to the actions that are visible. So if you have a daughter who is not able to find a husband, if you are a young lady that has been waiting for God's man, I would encourage you to look at the social interaction. Look at the history of your relationships in the church, your relationships in the neighborhood, your relationships with family, and your relationships in the marketplace. Look for anomalies. Look for behavior that is unrealistic. Look for reactions from other people that are not commensurate with the actions that you do. Then look at the generations. Look at your father's side, your mother's side. Trace the family back, the 2 or 3 generations that you know of, and ask yourself if there's any possibility that you are carrying a label. If there's any possibility that you are projecting in your spirit the iniquities of the past, iniquities that you may well have already confessed. In fact, in terms of that treason issue, a portion of that incident had been revealed in a previous ministry session, and those iniquities had been confessed, but they had not been confessed in the context of the label, and the label on the spirit had not been removed. Therefore, it was critical for her to ask God to remove the label. And in your situation, even though you walk impeccably, if your forefathers have done something sufficiently heinous to cause your spirit to be branded, you need to ask God to cover the sin, rebellion, and iniquity with His blood, to send the curses to the cross, but then to remove the brand and to put a new name on your spirit, the name of God's own choosing.